The morning sunlight streamed through the large bay windows of the Lancaster mansion, casting a golden glow on the polished wooden floors. Emma adjusted the cleaning supplies in her caddy as she made her way down the grand hallway. The mansion was a masterpiece of architecture. Vaulted ceilings, intricate moldings, and walls adorned with paintings that must have cost more than she could earn in a decade. She had worked here for years, yet the sheer opulence of the place never failed to astound her. It was a stark contrast to her modest apartment, where space was limited and luxury was a foreign concept. Emma's day always began the same way. She arrived early, often before the family had woken, and set to work in silence. The other staff joked that Emma had a knack for blending into the background, but she didn't mind. She liked being unnoticed. The Lancasters were polite but distant, treating her like another piece of the furniture, which suited her fine. She had no interest in being part of their lives or their drama, though bits of it inevitably spilled into her world. As she dusted the ornate vases in the drawing room, she overheard raised voices coming from the breakfast nook. Arthur Lancaster's booming tone was unmistakable, berating someone, likely his youngest son, Nicholas, who had a reputation for shirking responsibilities. Emma frowned but focused on her task, carefully avoiding any gestures that might draw attention. She knew better than to involve herself in their affairs. She was there to clean, not to eavesdrop. Later in the day, Emma made her way to the library, her favorite room in the mansion. It was rarely used, which meant it stayed relatively clean, but she enjoyed spending time there regardless. The scent of aged leather and paper filled the air, and the sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows created a kaleidoscope of colors on the shelves. The library was a world unto itself, a quiet haven amidst the chaos of the Lancaster household. As she arranged the books on the lowest shelf, her fingers brushed against a small gap. Frowning, Emma peered closer. One of the books seemed slightly out of place, its spine tilted at an odd angle. She tugged at it, expecting it to be stuck, but it came free easily. To her surprise, as she pulled the book away, a smaller leather-bound item fell from behind it, landing on the carpeted floor with a soft thud. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The leather cover was worn and cracked, and the edges of the pages were yellowed with age. It looked like a diary, and for a moment she hesitated. It wasn't hers, and she knew she had no business looking inside. But the temptation gnawed at her. The Lancasters' lives had always seemed so carefully controlled, their every action choreographed for the public eye. What secrets could this book possibly hold? Emma glanced around the empty library, the stillness of the room amplifying her heartbeat. Her hands moved almost on their own as she opened the diary to the first page. The neat handwriting read, Eleanor Lancaster, January 1953. She recognized the name immediately. Eleanor was the late matriarch of the Lancaster family, whose portrait hung prominently in the main hall. The family often spoke of her with reverence, painting her as a paragon of grace and virtue. Curiosity got the better of her, and Emma began to read. The first few entries were unremarkable, detailing Eleanor's daily life, charity events, social gatherings, and anecdotes about her children. But as Emma turned the pages, the tone shifted. Eleanor's voice grew more personal, more vulnerable. She wrote about her frustrations with Arthur, her feelings of isolation despite being surrounded by wealth, and the weight of maintaining a perfect image for the outside world. Emma's pulse quickened as she read further. The entries hinted at tension in the marriage, Eleanor's suspicions about Arthur's loyalty, and her growing sense of entrapment. Emma felt an unexpected connection to the words, as though Eleanor was speaking directly to her across the decades. It was startling to see the cracks in the facade of a family that appeared untouchable. Lost in the diary, Emma didn't notice the time passing until the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed. She quickly closed the book and slipped it into her cleaning caddy, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what she had stumbled upon, but something about the diary felt significant, as though it held answers to questions she didn't yet know to ask. For now, she decided it was best to keep it hidden. She would read more later, in the privacy of her own home, where the eyes and ears of the Lancaster household couldn't reach her. As she exited the library, Emma cast a final glance at the towering shelves, wondering how long the diary had been hidden there and why no one had found it before. It struck her that the Lancasters, for all their wealth and power, couldn't escape their own secrets. Whatever lay within the pages of Eleanor's diary, Emma felt certain that it was only the beginning. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back that evening, Emma sat cross-legged on the worn rug in her small living room, the diary resting in her lap. The flickering light of a cheap table lamp cast long shadows across the walls, but she hardly noticed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the leather-bound book again, eager to dive back into Eleanor Lancaster's world. For someone like Emma, who'd always viewed the Lancasters as untouchable pillars of wealth and prestige, this intimate glimpse into their private lives felt like stepping behind a velvet curtain at an exclusive show. The early entries were a mix of eloquence and practicality, written with a sharp mind and a candid tone that Emma hadn't expected. Eleanor's words painted the picture of a woman juggling the expectations of society with the demands of family life. She described lavish dinners, meticulously planned charity events, and afternoons spent with her young children in the mansion's sprawling gardens. But beneath the polished exterior, there was something else, something subtle but unmistakable. Emma turned the pages carefully, her gaze skimming across Eleanor's descriptions of Arthur. In the beginning, the affection in her words was genuine, even tender. She spoke of him with admiration, marveling at his ambition and how he carried himself with such confidence. But as the entries continued, cracks began to appear. Eleanor's tone shifted from pride to a kind of guarded unease. She hinted at moments when Arthur seemed distant, more absorbed in his work than in their marriage. "He's like a man forever chasing something," one entry read, "but I'm no longer certain he remembers why." It was the small, vulnerable details that struck Emma the most. Eleanor confessed to feeling invisible in her own home, despite the mansion teeming with staff and guests. There was a longing in her words, a quiet plea for someone to see her, not as Eleanor Lancaster, the wife of the great Arthur Lancaster, but as herself. Emma found herself nodding unconsciously, feeling an odd kinship with this woman who had lived decades before her. Even surrounded by luxury, Eleanor's isolation was palpable, and Emma couldn't help but wonder how many times she had passed by the portrait in the main hall without realizing the depth of the person behind it. Then came the entries about Arthur's growing absences. Eleanor recounted late nights spent waiting in the dimly lit sitting room, listening for the sound of his car in the driveway. The excuses, the business trips, the endless meetings. At first, she believed them, but doubt began to creep in. There was a distinct moment when her trust began to erode. "Tonight, he came home with a faint scent of perfume that isn't mine," Eleanor wrote. It lingered like an unwelcome guest. Emma's heart clenched as she read that line. She imagined Eleanor sitting in the very mansion she cleaned every day, feeling the sting of betrayal while trying to keep up the appearance of perfection. It was strange to think that the Lancasters, with all their power, faced the same human struggles as everyone else. But it wasn't just the betrayal. It was the way Eleanor described swallowing her suspicions, smiling through the pain, and pretending everything was fine for the sake of their image. Eleanor's entries became more fragmented after that, her thoughts spilling out in bursts. There were moments of defiance, where she vowed to confront Arthur, followed by waves of doubt that made her retreat into silence. "What would it matter if I spoke the truth?" one entry read. "The world would believe him over me. They always do." Emma paused, her thumb resting on the edge of the page. She thought about how Eleanor's world must have been so different from her own, yet this sentiment felt universal. How often had she herself stayed quiet, choosing peace over confrontation, even when she knew she was right? Eleanor's words felt like they had traveled across time, speaking directly to her. As the pages continued, there were hints of something deeper, a growing resentment that Eleanor struggled to contain. She wrote about small rebellions, like skipping a high-society luncheon to spend an afternoon sketching in the garden. She described moments of fleeting joy when she felt truly free, only to have them eclipsed by the reality of her life. Emma could see the battle unfolding within her. A woman torn between the role she was expected to play and the person she wanted to be. But then came a curious turn. Eleanor began writing about someone else. A man whose name she didn't mention, but whose presence was undeniable in her words. He looked at me like I was a person, not an ornament, she wrote in one entry. The ink smudged as though she had hesitated before finishing the thought. The tone of her writing changed when she spoke of him, growing lighter, almost hopeful. For the first time in the diary, there was a sense of possibility, of escape. Emma closed the book for a moment, her chest tight with emotion. She could feel the weight of Eleanor's world pressing down on her, the desperation, the fleeting glimpses of joy. It was more than she had bargained for when she first picked up the diary, but she couldn't stop now. Eleanor's story wasn't just gossip or scandal. It was a life laid bare, and Emma felt a growing obligation to see it through. Turning the page, she braced herself for what came next, knowing that with each entry, she was stepping further into a truth that someone, somewhere, had worked very hard to keep hidden. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she turned another page, her eyes scanning Eleanor's neat handwriting with growing intensity. The tone of the entries had shifted again, moving from the melancholy musings of a lonely wife to something sharper, more urgent. Eleanor was no longer merely observing the cracks in her marriage. She was documenting a storm brewing beneath the surface. The entries began detailing Arthur's frequent absences, and Eleanor's suspicions evolved into near certainty. She described the subtle changes in his demeanor, how he would avoid her eyes during conversations, how his answers to her questions became curt and evasive. "I feel as though I am living with a stranger," Eleanor wrote. "The man I married would never have treated me with such indifference. This man, this version of Arthur, is colder, calculating. It is as though he has stripped away every pretense of care." It was in the next entry that Eleanor's suspicions crystallized. She described overhearing a conversation between Arthur and a man named Charles, one of his closest business associates. Eleanor had been walking through the garden when she saw them in the gazebo, their voices low but urgent. She crouched behind the hedges, straining to hear, and caught fragments of their conversation. "She is becoming a liability," Charles had said. "If this gets out," the rest of his words were drowned out by the sound of a fountain bubbling nearby. But Eleanor was certain they were speaking about Arthur's affair. Her chest had tightened with anger, but what struck her most was Arthur's response. Instead of denying or defending anything, he had simply nodded, his expression grim. "I'll take care of it," he had said, his voice calm and resolute. Emma's stomach churned as she read those words. Arthur's promise to take care of it felt ominous, threatening. Eleanor had interpreted it the same way, and her entries following that day grew increasingly anxious. She began to fear that Arthur was not only willing to betray her, but would go to any lengths to protect himself. "He has always been ruthless in business," Eleanor wrote. "I never imagined he could be the same at home." The diary revealed more than just Arthur's betrayal. It exposed a web of manipulation and control that extended beyond their marriage. Eleanor described finding a letter tucked into one of Arthur's briefcases, written by a woman whose name she didn't recognize. The letter was an apology, filled with regret and sorrow, but its content suggested a relationship that had been more than professional. Eleanor didn't share the exact words of the letter in her diary, but the rage and hurt in her writing were unmistakable. "He does not even bother to hide his indiscretions anymore," she wrote. "It is as if he believes I am too weak to act." But Eleanor was far from weak. In the following entries, she documented her attempts to uncover the truth. She began watching Arthur more closely, tracking his comings and goings, noting the patterns in his behavior. Her observations were meticulous, almost clinical. "He leaves at precisely 7 o'clock on Thursdays," one entry read. Always the same excuse, a late-night meeting with investors. But no meeting lasts until dawn. Emma felt her respect for Eleanor growing with each page. Despite the constraints of her position, Eleanor had refused to remain passive. She had taken control in the only way she could, gathering evidence and preparing herself for whatever confrontation lay ahead. But it wasn't just Arthur she was watching. Eleanor's entries also hinted at growing mistrust within their social circle. She wrote about whispered conversations at dinner parties, sidelong glances from other women, and the creeping sense that she was the subject of gossip. Then came the revelation that shifted everything. Eleanor wrote about receiving an anonymous note delivered to the mansion by hand. The note was brief but chilling. "You should ask your husband about the arrangement with Charles. It isn't just about you anymore." Eleanor had no idea who had sent the note, but it had confirmed her worst fears, that Arthur's betrayal extended far beyond infidelity. The use of the word arrangement suggested something calculated, deliberate. It wasn't just a personal failing. It was part of a larger scheme. Eleanor's response to the note was a mix of fury and dread. She described confronting Arthur that evening, demanding answers. But Arthur, true to form, had deflected her accusations with practiced ease. "You're being hysterical," he had said, his tone patronizing. "Do you think I have time for these ridiculous fantasies?" His dismissal had only fueled Eleanor's anger, but she had realized that a direct confrontation would get her nowhere. Instead, she resolved to keep the note hidden and continue her quiet investigation. Emma felt her breath catch as she read the final entry on the page. Eleanor had written about her decision to confront Charles directly, believing he might be more forthcoming than Arthur. "If Arthur will not give me the truth," she wrote, "I will take it from someone who will." There was a determination in her words that sent a shiver down Emma's spine. Eleanor had been willing to risk everything to uncover the reality of her husband's actions. Emma closed the diary for a moment, her heart pounding. The revelations were almost too much to process. Arthur's betrayal wasn't just personal. It was insidious, woven into the fabric of the life they had built together. And Eleanor, despite her fear and heartbreak, had chosen to fight back. Emma couldn't help but wonder what had happened when Eleanor confronted Charles, and whether it had set in motion the events that led to her untimely death. The answers, Emma knew, lay further in the diary. As Emma turned the page, Eleanor's writing took on an entirely different tone, one that caught her off guard. It was lighter, almost lyrical, with a tenderness that stood in stark contrast to the anger and dread of the previous entries. For the first time, the name Henry appeared, scrawled carefully in the corner of a page, almost as if Eleanor hadn't meant to write it at all. The entry was brief, but brimming with emotion. "Henry looked at me today in a way that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. For a moment, I forgot who I was supposed to be." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Henry. This wasn't Arthur or any of the names Eleanor had written about before. This was someone new, someone who clearly wasn't meant to be part of her carefully curated world. Emma leaned in, eager to uncover the truth about this mysterious figure who had stirred something in Eleanor that even her vast wealth couldn't provide. As the entries continued, Eleanor began to describe her interactions with Henry in more detail. He wasn't from their world of galas, power plays, and ruthless ambition. He was an artist, quiet, thoughtful, and refreshingly different from the polished, superficial men she was used to. Eleanor first met him during an outing arranged by a friend, an attempt to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the mansion. She hadn't expected anything significant from the trip, but when Henry spoke to her, it was as though he saw straight past her carefully crafted exterior. "He didn't look at me the way everyone else does," Eleanor wrote. "Not as Mrs. Arthur Lancaster, not as a figurehead or a trophy. He looked at me as if I were just a woman, flawed and human, and he didn't seem to mind." Emma felt a pang of sadness reading those words. For someone as wealthy and admired as Eleanor to feel invisible, even within her marriage, was a reminder that loneliness could creep into even the most gilded of cages. Henry seemed to have offered her a lifeline, a glimpse of a life where she could be free from the constraints of her title and expectations. Eleanor's entries became more daring as her relationship with Henry deepened. At first, they were stolen moments, an accidental brush of hands during a gallery visit, a shared smile in the corner of a crowded room. But soon, those moments turned into deliberate meetings. Eleanor wrote about slipping away from the mansion under the pretense of errands, her heart pounding as she made her way to Henry's modest studio. She described the intoxicating mix of fear and exhilaration as they spent hours together. talking about art, life, and dreams she'd long buried. He makes me feel alive in a way I didn't know I was missing, she wrote. When I'm with him, I am not Eleanor Lancaster. I am just Eleanor. Emma could almost hear the defiance in those words, the quiet rebellion of a woman who had lived too long under the weight of others' expectations. But with each entry, the stakes grew higher. Eleanor's happiness was tinged with guilt and the constant fear of discovery. She wrote about her internal struggle, torn between the life she had built with Arthur and the love she was beginning to feel for Henry. One entry, written hastily, revealed the danger of her situation. Arthur's temper grows worse each day. He has begun to question my absences, and I see the suspicion in his eyes. I fear what he might do if he learns the truth. Emma felt her pulse quicken. Eleanor's fears weren't unfounded. Arthur had already proven himself capable of cold manipulation in his business dealings and personal life. If he discovered her affair, there was no telling what lengths he might go to in order to protect his reputation. Eleanor's growing love for Henry was beautiful, but fraught with peril. Then came an entry that shifted everything. Eleanor described a night when Henry confessed his feelings for her. They had been sitting in his studio, surrounded by half-finished sketches and the faint scent of turpentine. He took her hands in his and told her he loved her, not just for her beauty or her grace, but for the person she was beneath it all. Eleanor's words in the diary trembled with raw emotion. No one has ever spoken to me that way. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it might be like to build a life with him, away from all of this. But Eleanor knew it was impossible. She wrote of the weight of her responsibilities, the children who depended on her, and the scandal that would erupt if her affair came to light. I cannot leave, no matter how much I want to. I am tethered to this life, for better or worse. Still, she continued to see Henry, unable to resist the solace he provided. Yet her entries grew darker, reflecting her increasing paranoia. She described moments when she felt she was being followed, shadows lurking in the corners of her world. Arthur's questions became more pointed, his gaze more penetrating. He knows something, Eleanor wrote. He may not have proof, but he knows. Emma closed the diary for a moment, her chest tightening. Eleanor's affair with Henry wasn't just a love story. It was a desperate grasp at freedom in a life that had left her emotionally imprisoned. But the storm brewing around them was undeniable. Arthur's power and control loomed over every page, a reminder that this story could only end one way, in tragedy. Emma hesitated before turning the next page, steeling herself for the unraveling she knew was coming. Eleanor had found love, but in the Lancaster world, love like that came with a cost. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, Emma flipped the page, her heart heavy with anticipation. The tone of Eleanor's diary had grown darker. The lightness and hope Henry had brought in her life, now eclipsed by something heavier, something unavoidable. Eleanor's careful words seemed to weigh more, as though every entry carried the tension of a tightly wound spring ready to snap. Arthur's suspicions, which had once been vague and dismissive, were now sharp and deliberate. Eleanor described the moments when his cold, calculating demeanor turned unervingly attentive. He watches me now, she wrote, the ink pressed harder into the page. Every move, every glance, I feel the weight of his eyes on me, even in the quiet moments. The betrayal didn't come all at once. It was more like the slow unraveling of a tightly held secret. Eleanor began noticing small, unsettling changes in her world. A letter she had hidden in her vanity, a brief note from Henry telling her he missed her, had gone missing. She described the panic she felt searching for it, her fingers trembling as she tore through drawers and boxes. It was there, she wrote. I know it was, and now it's gone. Arthur hadn't mentioned the letter, but his questions about her whereabouts became increasingly pointed. He would catch her off guard during dinner, asking why she had been late returning from town or why she had stopped attending her usual charity luncheons. Eleanor's replies were careful, measured, but she could feel the trap tightening around her. It wasn't just Arthur. Eleanor wrote about an unsettling conversation with Charles, Arthur's closest confidant. He had cornered her at a social event, his words dripping with thinly veiled warnings. "You should be more careful," he had said, his tone casual but his eyes cold. "This is a delicate time for the family. A misstep could undo everything Arthur has worked so hard to build." Eleanor had smiled politely, her heart pounding, but she knew what he meant. Arthur had spoken to him, and Charles, ever the loyal ally, was reminding her of her place. "The walls are closing in," she wrote, her words shaky. "Arthur's reach is everywhere, even in the shadows. I don't know where to turn." Emma felt a chill run through her as she read. She could almost see Eleanor, elegant and composed on the outside, crumbling beneath the weight of the deception she was forced to live with. It wasn't just her affair with Henry. It was the looming threat of Arthur's retaliation, the impossibility of escape. The diary revealed that Eleanor had tried to distance herself from Henry, not out of lack of love, but out of fear. "I told him we should stop," she wrote in a heart-wrenching entry. "He looked at me with such sadness, but he didn't argue. He said he only wanted me to be safe. I couldn't bring myself to tell him that there's no safety for me anymore." But the betrayal wasn't just in Arthur's cold watchfulness or Charles's warnings. It was in the way Eleanor's world seemed to conspire against her. She described a day when she went to visit Henry at his studio, only to find it empty. The door was locked, the windows dark. When she asked around, no one seemed to know where he had gone. "He wouldn't leave without telling me," she wrote, desperation bleeding through the words. "Something isn't right." The days that followed were filled with silence. Henry didn't send word, and her attempts to contact him were met with dead ends. Eleanor's entries became fragmented, her fear turning to dread. "What if Arthur knows?" she wrote. "What if he's done something? I can't stop thinking about the letter, the way it disappeared. What if it was the key to all of this?" Then, in one devastating entry, Eleanor's suspicions were confirmed. She described confronting Arthur in the drawing room late one evening, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. She asked him outright if he knew where Henry was, her voice trembling. Arthur's response was a cruel smile, one that made her blood run cold. "You should focus on your family, Eleanor," he had said, his tone icy. "Some distractions have a way of disappearing when they're no longer useful." The betrayal wasn't just in Arthur's words. It was in what they didn't say. Eleanor realized, with a sinking heart, that Henry hadn't vanished by accident. Arthur had done something, though she didn't know what. The man she had trusted, the father of her children, had crossed a line she hadn't believed he was capable of crossing. Emma's fingers tightened around the edges of the diary as she read Eleanor's despair. The remaining entries in this section of the diary were short, hurried, and filled with terror. Eleanor described sleepless nights, shadows in the hallways, and the sense that she was being followed. "Arthur has taken everything from me," she wrote. "Henry is gone, and I am left to play the role of dutiful wife. But I will not go quietly." The final words on the page sent a shiver down Emma's spine. "He may have won this round, but he doesn't know everything. Not yet." Emma closed the diary for a moment, her breath uneven. Eleanor's betrayal wasn't just by her husband. It was by the entire life she had been forced to lead, a life that turned love into danger and trust into a weapon. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's story wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning. Whatever came next, Emma knew, would only deepen the darkness Eleanor had been forced to endure. Emma sat on the edge of her small bed, the diary resting heavily in her lap. She had read enough to know that Eleanor's story was more than just a tragic tale of love and betrayal. It was a mystery filled with unanswered questions and chilling implications. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the pieces didn't quite fit together. What had truly happened to Henry? How far had Arthur gone to protect himself? And why had no one ever spoken of this part of the Lancaster family's history? The questions gnawed at her, refusing to let her rest. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the mansion's grand facade, Emma found herself drawn back to the library. Her footsteps echoed softly on the polished floor as she stepped inside, the room enveloping her in its familiar stillness. She scanned the rows of books, searching for anything that might connect to Eleanor's story. It wasn't just idle curiosity anymore. Something about the diary had awakened a determination in her, a need to uncover the truth hidden within the walls of this house. Emma began carefully pulling books from the shelves, her fingers brushing against the spines in search of loose pages, notes, or anything out of place. Her mind raced with possibilities. If Eleanor had hidden her diary here, what else might she have left behind? The Lancasters had lived in this mansion for generations, their lives meticulously recorded in photographs, letters, and trinkets. But the family's carefully curated image had clearly left out Eleanor's turmoil. Emma wondered how much of the Lancaster legacy was built on carefully buried lies. Her search led her to a lower shelf, where she found an old, leather-bound photo album. It was dusty, its cover worn, as though it hadn't been touched in years. Emma hesitated for a moment before opening it, the thick pages crackling softly under her fingers. The photographs inside were black and white, their edges slightly curled with age. They showed the Lancasters in their prime, Arthur and Eleanor standing together at galas, their smiles perfect but their eyes distant. In one photo, Eleanor held a young boy, her son, with a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As Emma flipped through the pages, she noticed something strange. There were gaps in the album where photographs had clearly been removed. The empty corners, once held in place by small adhesive mounts, told a story of their own. Someone had gone through this album and carefully erased certain moments. Emma's pulse quickened. What had been in those missing photos? And who had taken the time to remove them? She turned to the back of the album and found a folded piece of paper tucked into the spine. It was yellowed with age, the edges brittle. Carefully, she unfolded it, revealing a handwritten note. The handwriting wasn't Eleanor's, but it was familiar, Arthur's. The note was brief but chilling. This must never leave the family. Destroy it if necessary. There was no context, no explanation, but the implication was clear. Arthur had been aware of something he wanted to keep hidden. Emma slipped the note into her pocket, her hands trembling. She knew she was venturing into dangerous territory. Arthur Lancaster was not a man who tolerated insubordination, even from the staff. And while he might be too old now to act on his temper, the Lancaster family still carried enough power to ruin lives. But Emma couldn't stop herself. The more she uncovered, the more she felt a strange connection to Eleanor, as though the woman's story was crying out to be told after decades of silence. Her growing curiosity began to spill into other parts of the mansion. While cleaning the master bedroom one morning, Emma noticed a faint scratch on the edge of Arthur's desk, as if a drawer had been forced open. It was subtle, almost invisible, but once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. As she wiped the surface, her eyes flicked toward the drawer. Was it locked? She gave it a gentle tug and found it wouldn't budge. Something about the way it resisted her made her certain there was more inside. What could Arthur be keeping locked away, even now, in his twilight years? Emma's thoughts consumed her. Even during her breaks, she found herself retracing Eleanor's steps in her mind. What had it been like for Eleanor to live here, suffocated by the weight of her husband's lies and the fear of being discovered? And what had truly happened to Henry? Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay somewhere in this house. Eleanor's diary had been a key, but it wasn't enough. There were still pieces missing, and Emma was determined to find them. Her determination began to attract attention. Margaret, one of the older maids, pulled her aside one afternoon in the kitchen. "You've been spending a lot of time in the library," Margaret said, her voice low but firm. "You need to be careful, Emma. This family doesn't take kindly to people poking around where they shouldn't." Emma met Margaret's gaze, her heart pounding. Why does it matter? The Lancasters have secrets, don't they? Things they don't want anyone to know. Margaret's expression darkened. Of course they do. Every family like this does. But those secrets are what keep people like us employed. You're playing a dangerous game, Emma. Let it go. But Emma couldn't let it go. Margaret's warning only confirmed what she already suspected. There was more to this story than anyone wanted to admit. And if the Lancasters had gone to such lengths to bury the past, then it was all the more important for Emma to bring it to light. That evening, as she returned to her small apartment, Emma pulled out the diary again. She reread the last entries, letting Eleanor's words sink in. The woman had been silenced, her life reduced to a forgotten portrait and a name on a family tree. Emma couldn't let that be the end. Eleanor had left her story behind for a reason, and Emma felt an unshakable obligation to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As the days passed, Emma found herself increasingly consumed by the mystery surrounding Eleanor Lancaster and her secret life. The diary had offered glimpses into Eleanor's heartache, her fear, and her defiance. But there was one piece of the puzzle that still haunted her: the sudden and unexplained disappearance of Henry. Every entry Emma read about him deepened her sense of dread, and the more she thought about it, the more questions arose. What had happened to him? And why did Eleanor's last entry suggest that Arthur's involvement in Henry's vanishing was more than just a suspicion? One afternoon, as Emma worked in the study, tidying up the desk and dusting the shelves, her mind kept wandering back to the diary. She had gone through it so many times, retracing Eleanor's words, trying to uncover some hidden meaning or overlooked detail. There was one sentence, one chilling note that she couldn't shake off. It was the last line Eleanor had written about Henry before his disappearance. "If I can't find him, I will never be free." The desperation in those words was unmistakable. Emma had been careful not to draw too much attention to her curiosity, but it was becoming more difficult to conceal her growing obsession. Every moment she wasn't cleaning or serving the family, she was lost in the pages of Eleanor's diary, trying to piece together the fragments of a story that was still shrouded in mystery. Emma's quiet determination was fueled by a feeling she couldn't ignore. She had to find out what happened to Henry. That night, after a long day of cleaning and errands, Emma returned to her small apartment, exhausted but restless. The street outside her window was quiet, the occasional car passing by, and the glow of the streetlights flickering in the distance. She made a cup of tea, her hands steady despite the gnawing tension in her chest, and sat at the small kitchen table. The diary lay before her, its leather cover cracked and worn, the pages filled with Eleanor's secrets. She reopened it to the entries she had marked, the ones that chronicled the days leading up to Henry's disappearance. The last few pages were jumbled, almost frantic, the words spilling out in a rush. Eleanor's fear had escalated, as though she could sense that something terrible was about to happen. She had written about Henry's increasing distance, the sudden silence in their secret world. He had stopped visiting her at the studio, his letters had stopped coming, and even his messages had grown sparse. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. "Where are you, Henry?" Eleanor had written. "Did you leave on your own? Or did someone force you? I need to know. I have to find you." But there were no answers. Henry's disappearance was marked by a deep silence that no one in Eleanor's life seemed to acknowledge. Even Arthur, though he was suspicious, didn't seem to care much for the absence of the man who had clearly stolen his wife's heart. It was as though the entire world had decided to pretend nothing was amiss. Emma turned the page, her eyes scanning the ink-stained paper. The next entry was even more alarming. Eleanor described a conversation with one of Arthur's colleagues, a man named James West, who had been around when Henry had started to disappear. "I overheard James speaking to Arthur in the study the other day," Eleanor wrote. "He mentioned Henry's name, and I swear I saw a flicker of recognition in Arthur's eyes. Why would he know about Henry?" Emma's heart raced as she read. Why hadn't Arthur addressed it more directly? If he knew about Henry's disappearance, why didn't he act? The implications of Eleanor's words were clear. Arthur knew something that hadn't been spoken aloud. And whatever that something was, it was enough to make Eleanor's worst fear come true. She knew she had to act. Emma couldn't sit idly by any longer. She had already seen the signs that the Lancaster family was built on lies, but this was different. Henry's disappearance was the core of Eleanor's unraveling world, and Emma had to know the truth. She had to dig deeper. The next day, Emma's resolve hardened as she worked around the mansion. As she cleaned the dining room, she noticed Arthur's office door slightly ajar, a faint light spilling from the crack. She knew it wasn't her place to intrude, but today, the temptation was too much. She set down her cleaning supplies and, after glancing down the hallway to ensure no one was around, she carefully approached the door. The faint murmur of voices drifted from inside. She paused, listening intently. It was Arthur, speaking to someone, but she couldn't make out the words. Her pulse quickened, and before she could talk herself out of it, she gently pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. Through the small gap, she saw Arthur standing by his desk, speaking in low tones to a man she recognized, James West. Their conversation was hushed, but Emma could clearly see the intensity on both men's faces. Something was wrong. Her breath caught as she watched James lean in, lowering his voice even further. "You know it has to be done? She'll never let it go," James said. Arthur nodded slowly, his face hardening. "I've already taken care of it. It's too dangerous now. We can't let her find out." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to hear more. It was clear what they were discussing. The words "too dangerous" and "can't let her find out" hung in the air like a warning. It wasn't just about Eleanor's affair. It was about the disappearance of Henry. Whatever had happened to him, it had been orchestrated by Arthur and James. They had silenced him, removed him from the picture. And now, Eleanor was left to pick up the pieces of a life she had lost, without even knowing where to turn. Emma's legs felt weak beneath her. She backed away from the door, her mind reeling. She needed to find more proof. She had to be certain before she did anything, before she confronted anyone. But one thing was clear. Arthur Lancaster had more blood on his hands than Emma had ever imagined. She left the office, her heart pounding in her chest. Emma knew now that she couldn't go back. Whatever she uncovered next, it would change everything. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, it was late one evening when Emma found herself in the kitchen, wiping down the countertops after a long day's work. The house was quiet, with only the distant hum of the mansion's heating system filling the air. Emma had grown used to the silence after hours, when the family retreated to their private spaces and the staff had the run of the house. It was during these late hours that Emma often found herself most restless, her mind constantly returning to the dark secrets of the Lancaster family. She was lost in thought, wondering again about Henry and the strange circumstances of his disappearance, when the sound of a soft cough interrupted her. Emma turned to find Margaret, the elderly housekeeper, standing in the doorway. Margaret had worked in the Lancaster household for decades, her hair now silvered with age and her movements slower than they used to be. Though she was kind, Margaret had always been somewhat of an enigma to Emma. She had a way of watching people, observing them quietly, but never truly revealing anything about herself. "Couldn't sleep? Could you?" Margaret's voice was low, but there was a knowing edge to it, as if she had been watching Emma for days. Emma hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to draw attention to her late-night habits, but something in Margaret's expression made her pause. "Just cleaning up," Emma said with a half-hearted smile, trying to cover the unease that had crept into her voice. Margaret raised an eyebrow, then leaned against the doorframe, folding her arms. "You've been at that desk a lot lately. Not like you to get lost in books." Emma's heart skipped. The desk. She had been so careful to keep the diary hidden, but Margaret's sharp eyes hadn't missed a thing. "You've been going through that old diary, haven't you?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, but there was no mistaking the weight of her words. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. I didn't mean to," Emma stammered, but Margaret held up a hand to stop her. "No need to explain, child. I've known about that diary for years." Margaret's gaze softened, and for the first time, Emma saw something akin to sympathy in her eyes. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're not the first to stumble across Eleanor's secrets." Emma's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? You knew about the affair? About Henry?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I did, but there's more to it than you know. Much more." She paused, her gaze distant, as though she were traveling back in time. "I suppose it's time someone told you the truth." Emma sat down on one of the chairs near the kitchen table, her hands gripping the edges as if she needed something to anchor her. Margaret, taking a seat opposite her, leaned in, her voice becoming even more hushed, as though someone might overhear. "You see, Henry wasn't just some romantic fling for Eleanor. He was someone who threatened to unravel everything the Lancaster family had built. He knew things Arthur couldn't afford for anyone to know." Emma's mind raced. "What things?" Margaret looked at her for a long moment before responding, as though weighing the consequences of her words. Arthur Lancaster is not the man he pretends to be. Oh, he's charming, he's powerful, and he has a way of making everyone believe he's above reproach. But the truth is, he's ruthless. When Henry came into Eleanor's life, he knew too much about Arthur's dealings, dirty deals that could have exposed the family's empire to the public. Emma's breath caught in her throat. You're saying Arthur? He was involved in Henry's disappearance? Margaret nodded, her eyes darkening. Not just involved. He orchestrated it. Henry was a threat, and Arthur couldn't let that go unpunished. The affair between Eleanor and Henry wasn't just an act of love or betrayal. It was a ticking time bomb. If the truth came out, it would destroy everything Arthur had worked for. So he did what any man in his position would do. He removed the problem. The weight of Margaret's words settled over Emma like a heavy fog. She had suspected Arthur's cruelty, but hearing the truth out loud was something else entirely. How could Eleanor? How could she not know? She knew, Margaret said quietly. But Eleanor was trapped. She loved Henry, yes, but she was also terrified of what Arthur might do if she left him. The family's reputation, their future, it all depended on Arthur's success. She didn't have the luxury of choosing love over security. Emma sat in stunned silence, trying to process what Margaret had just told her. It was one thing to suspect betrayal and greed in a family like the Lancasters, but to hear it laid out so plainly was overwhelming. Margaret was right. Eleanor had been trapped in a gilded cage, forced to choose between the man she loved and the life she had built. And the diary? Emma asked after a long pause. Why keep it? Why write it all down? Margaret sighed, looking at the floor. Because Eleanor wanted the truth to be known. She never stopped loving Henry, and she wanted someone, anyone, to remember him. To know that he wasn't just a footnote in their perfect family's history. She knew what Arthur was capable of, and she feared that, one day, the truth would come out. She wrote it down because it was the only way to keep Henry's memory alive. Emma's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. She felt a rush of empathy for Eleanor, but also something else, a growing sense of injustice. The story didn't end with Henry's disappearance. It never could. And now, Emma was caught in the middle of a legacy that was as much hers to uncover as it was to protect. Thank you for telling me this, Emma said softly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Margaret gave a small, knowing smile. Just don't let the Lancasters think they can bury the past. Sometimes, the truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deep you try to bury it. The next morning, Emma woke with a feeling of dread she couldn't shake off. Margaret's cryptic words from the night before still echoed in her mind. The housekeeper had always seemed like a fixture of the mansion, someone who had seen it all but kept her distance. But now, there was a tension between them, a shift that Emma couldn't ignore. Margaret knew something. More than that, she seemed to want Emma to know it too. Emma had hoped she could continue her quiet investigation into Eleanor's life, reading the diary and searching for more answers. But Margaret's unspoken warning had changed everything. She couldn't just go on reading the diary, hoping to piece things together in secret. The reality of the situation was too dangerous now. She had crossed a line. She couldn't turn back, and she wasn't sure whether she even wanted to. That afternoon, while cleaning the upper halls, Emma spotted Arthur Lancaster in the distance. His sharp, calculating gaze swept over her, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had never spoken to him directly, but his presence was always oppressive, as though he could see right through her. And today, something in the way he looked at her felt different, sharper, more dangerous. She hurriedly turned down a corridor, trying to avoid him, but her pulse raced. She couldn't escape the feeling that Arthur knew or suspected that she was digging into the past. Later that evening, Emma's worst fears came to fruition. She had just returned to her small quarters, the diary still clutched in her hands, when the door to her room suddenly swung open. Arthur stood in the doorway, tall and imposing, his face hard as granite. His eyes were cold, and for the first time, Emma saw the full weight of his power in the way he carried himself. He wasn't just the head of the household. He was a man who had lived in the shadows, controlling everything in his path. "I know what you've been doing, Emma." Arthur's voice was low, calm, but there was an underlying threat in every word. "You've been poking around where you shouldn't be." Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. How much did he know? Her pulse raced, and for a split second, she considered denying everything, claiming ignorance. But the way he looked at her, unblinking, unwavering, told her that denial wouldn't save her now. I don't know what you mean, sir," she said, forcing herself to sound more confident than she felt. "I'm just doing my job. I have it." "Don't lie to me," Arthur interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. "You think I don't notice when someone starts digging around my family's past? You've been going through Eleanor's things, reading her diary. You think I haven't noticed?" Emma's heart sank, her mind spinning as she searched for a way out. She had been so careful, so quiet in her search for the truth, but now it was all unraveling before her eyes. She had always known that the Lancaster family carried secrets, but she had never imagined that the weight of those secrets would come crashing down on her so quickly. Arthur stepped closer, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. "You don't understand, do you? This isn't just about Eleanor or some long-lost affair. This is about power. The kind of power that doesn't let go easily." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "If you continue digging, if you keep asking the wrong questions, there will be consequences. You think you can escape the family's reach? You're wrong. People like us don't forget. And we don't forgive." Emma's breath hitched in her chest. She had heard rumors, whispers of those who had crossed the Lancasters in the past, only to vanish from the social scene without a trace. She had never believed them, thought them to be mere gossip. But now, as she stood in front of Arthur, her blood running cold with fear, she wasn't so sure. "I don't want trouble," Emma whispered, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to stay calm. I just wanted to understand. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Arthur's lip curled into a faint, almost amused smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You've already hurt us," he said, his voice chilling. "But you're not the first to make that mistake. I suggest you stop now, Emma. Leave the past where it belongs, buried and forgotten. You have no idea what you're getting into." For a moment, there was silence, thick and heavy. Emma could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, suffocating her. She had known that uncovering the family's secrets would come with a price, but she hadn't anticipated this kind of danger, this kind of threat. She had believed, foolishly, that the past was something she could unravel from a safe distance. Now, the past was closing in on her, and the cost of knowing the truth felt far greater than she had ever imagined. Arthur lingered for a moment longer, his eyes locked on hers, before he turned on his heel and left without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and Emma was left standing in the center of her room, her thoughts spinning in 1,000 different directions. She knew now that there was no turning back. The secrets of the Lancaster family weren't just buried. They were dangerous. And if she didn't tread carefully, she might find herself buried alongside them. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the next few days passed in a blur for Emma. Every moment felt like a careful balancing act between continuing her duties in the mansion and trying to piece together the puzzle of Eleanor's life. She couldn't shake the feeling that her discovery of the diary had somehow put her in the center of something much bigger, something she wasn't fully prepared for. The threat from Arthur, his unsettling stare that day, weighed heavily on her. Margaret's veiled warning echoed in her mind as well. If she wasn't careful, she could become a casualty of a battle much older and far more dangerous than she ever imagined. But the more Emma thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't let the mystery rest. Eleanor's story had become personal to her in a way she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the scandalous affair or the disappearance of Henry that had captivated her. It was the silence that followed. The way no one had spoken of the events that had unfolded in the Lancaster family. She couldn't live with the nagging questions anymore. She needed to know the truth, even if it meant risking everything. One evening, after dinner, when the family had retired to their private quarters, Emma found herself back in the library. The air in the room was thick with dust and stillness. She wasn't supposed to be in here, but she had to go back to the place where it all began. The diary, the clues, it was all in this room. She knew she had to be careful. Arthur was often in and out of his study just down the hall, and there was always the possibility that someone would pass by. This time, she wasn't interested in the diary alone. She needed more. Emma had begun to notice small inconsistencies. Papers, letters, half-forgotten documents tucked away in the far corners of bookshelves. The more she looked, the more she realized that the mansion was full of secrets, hiding in plain sight. She moved quietly, methodically, pulling down books and searching behind framed portraits, glancing nervously at the door every few seconds. It was in a locked drawer at the far side of the room that Emma found her first breakthrough. The drawer was rarely used, and she knew it had to belong to one of the Lancasters. She had seen Arthur retrieve papers from it on occasion, always with an air of importance. But today, the drawer was unlatched, perhaps an oversight, or perhaps she was meant to find it. Inside, buried beneath old invoices and personal letters, was a faded photograph. It wasn't of the Lancaster family, nor was it anything Emma had seen before. It was a photo of Henry, standing next to a woman she didn't recognize, both of them looking more carefree and natural than anyone she'd ever seen in the Lancaster household. The woman was smiling, her arm casually draped around Henry's waist, and they seemed to be at a small gathering, far from the high society events that the Lancasters were known for. Emma studied it closely, her heart racing. This wasn't just a photograph, it was evidence. Evidence of something real between Henry and someone who had remained entirely hidden from the family's narrative. But there was more. Underneath the photo, tucked in a plain envelope, was a letter written in Eleanor's familiar script. Emma unfolded it carefully, feeling a sense of trepidation as she read the contents. It was a letter from Eleanor to Henry, written just days before his disappearance. "I cannot live like this," it began. "Arthur knows. He knows everything. I fear he will do something terrible if he finds out. But I can't leave you, Henry. Not now." The rest of the letter was a frantic plea for them to meet again, to find a way to escape before it was too late. Eleanor's words were filled with fear, her love for Henry palpable in the urgency of her writing. It was clear now that Arthur's suspicions had gone beyond mere jealousy. They had become an obsession, and Eleanor's affair was no longer just a threat to her marriage. It was a threat to the very stability of the Lancaster Empire. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. She folded the letter back into the envelope and placed everything exactly as she had found it. This was bigger than she had anticipated. Arthur wasn't just trying to protect his image. He was covering up something far more sinister, something that could destroy everything. As Emma moved to leave the library, her heart was pounding. She had what she needed, at least she thought she did. But the fear that had lingered in the back of her mind now clawed at her. There was no going back. She had crossed the line, and the more she uncovered, the more dangerous it became. The feeling of being watched, of being too close to the truth, was suffocating. Just as she was about to slip out the door, a shadow in the hallway caught her eye. Her breath hitched. She froze. Had someone been watching her the whole time? Emma had never felt the house so oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder, every shadow in the corners of the hallways more threatening. The discovery of the hidden family secrets had turned her world upside down. Now, with everything spiraling, Emma was certain that she could no longer hide behind the walls of the mansion. The tension between her and the Lancasters had become palpable, and the looming confrontation was inevitable. She had uncovered something they wanted to stay buried, and she knew they would stop at nothing to protect their carefully constructed image. That night, as Emma worked in the kitchen, trying to ignore the dread that had been building inside her, she heard footsteps approaching. She stiffened instinctively. It was Arthur. She could tell by the cadence of his steps, the heavy, deliberate pace that only he had. Emma's heart raced. She had avoided him for days, but this time, she wouldn't be able to. She had to face him. He appeared in the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the dimly lit room. His eyes were cold, unreadable, but Emma could sense the storm brewing behind them. He didn't speak immediately, just stood there, observing her with a chilling calm. Emma wiped her hands on the dish towel, trying to steady her breathing. "Emma," Arthur's voice broke the silence, low and measured. like a predator sizing up its prey. "I've been meaning to speak with you." She forced herself to meet his gaze, her palms sweating against the fabric of the towel. "Is there something you need, sir?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the fear that churned inside her. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the kitchen. "I know what you've been doing," he said, his voice now colder, more threatening. "I don't know how much you think you understand, but I'm telling you now, you should stop." Emma's breath caught in her throat. He knew. Somehow he knew. Her mind raced, but she stood firm, forcing herself to remain composed. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice tight but steady. Arthur's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something close to anger in his gaze. "You think I don't see it? The way you've been sneaking around, digging through things that don't concern you. The way you've been reading things you have no business reading." His voice dropped, becoming more sinister. "You should know, Emma, that curiosity has its price. Some things are better left untouched." Emma swallowed hard but refused to back down. Her grip on the dish towel tightened, but she couldn't let herself show weakness. "I'm just cleaning, sir. That's all I'm doing," she said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. Arthur studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before he took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "I know you've been reading Eleanor's diary," he said, the words hanging in the air like a threat. "You've uncovered a lot more than you should have, and now you think you're in control of this situation. But you're not. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." Emma's heart pounded in her chest, and her thoughts swirled in a blur. She had always known there was more to the Lancaster family than met the eye, but standing face to face with Arthur now, it was clear that the stakes were far higher than she'd imagined. She took a step back, trying to put some space between them, but Arthur remained unyielding, towering over her. "You don't understand," he continued, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. "The things you've read, the secrets you've uncovered, they were buried for a reason. Eleanor's life, Henry's disappearance, they were all part of a bigger game. A game you can't possibly comprehend." Emma's breath quickened. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to Henry? What did you do to him?" Arthur's face flickered with something. Was it guilt? Fear? But it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold, calculating resolve. He took a step closer, until Emma could feel his breath on her face. "If you're smart, Emma, you'll drop this. Forget everything you think you know. I'm giving you a chance to walk away before it's too late." But Emma was past the point of turning back. Her hands clenched at her sides as she looked him in the eye. "You think I'm afraid of you?" she asked, her voice steady, though her heart raced in her chest. "You think I'll just ignore the truth because you tell me to?" Arthur didn't respond immediately. He simply watched her, his gaze calculating. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph, holding it out for Emma to see. It was an old photo of Eleanor, beautiful, young, and radiant, standing beside a man Emma didn't recognize. The man had his arm around her waist, and they looked like they belonged to a different world entirely. "This is Henry," Arthur said quietly. "He wasn't just an affair, Emma. He was a liability. And you don't want to know what we had to do to make sure that part of our history stayed buried." The words hung in the air, thick with threat. Emma's stomach churned, the weight of his implication settling heavily on her chest. She had uncovered a secret that could destroy everything. Everything Arthur had worked for, everything the Lancaster family had carefully protected. And now, she was tangled in it, whether she wanted to be or not. Arthur's voice dropped to a near whisper, the menace in it unmistakable. "This is your last warning, Emma. Stay away from things you don't understand. Because if you keep digging, you won't like what you find." Emma stood frozen, her heart pounding in her ears. She couldn't look away from the photo, from the ghost of Henry that lingered in it. And in that moment, she understood. She had crossed a line that she could never uncross. The truth was out there, but at what cost? The silence between them felt like an unbearable weight, pressing in from all sides. Arthur stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. There was no anger in his expression, at least not the kind Emma had expected. It was something colder, more calculated. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to hide, but everything to lose. Emma's pulse quickened, her palms sweating despite the chill in the air. She didn't know what to say or how to even begin the conversation that had been building between them for days. But she knew this moment was coming. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The way he had watched her lately, the unsettling weight of his gaze, the subtle shifts in the house's rhythm. Everything had been building to this point. "Do you know what you're doing?" Arthur's voice was soft, almost gentle, as if he were trying to coax something out of her. "Do you really understand what you found?" Emma swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She wanted to deny it, wanted to pretend she was just a maid, doing her job, minding her own business. But she wasn't fooling anyone, least of all herself. She had uncovered too much, seen too many things, and now she had to face the consequences. "I don't understand what's happening here," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "But I know something isn't right." Arthur took a slow step forward, his presence filling the small kitchen, making it feel even smaller. "You think you've uncovered something," he said, his tone almost amused, "but you're just scratching the surface. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Emma clenched her fists, trying to push back the rising fear that threatened to take over. "Then tell me, why did Henry disappear? Why did Eleanor write about him like that?" The words came out more forcefully than she intended, but she couldn't stop herself. The answers had been buried for too long. She needed to know. Arthur's eyes darkened, a flicker of something, anger, frustration, passing through them. He took another step closer, lowering his voice. Eleanor's affair with Henry wasn't just a mistake. It was a liability. It threatened everything we worked for. His voice softened again, almost as if he were talking to himself. Eleanor was fragile. I knew she would break, and that meant everything could fall apart. But I never expected her to get so caught up in it. Emma's mind raced. This wasn't just a family scandal. It was the reason Eleanor had disappeared from the family's public life so abruptly. Arthur was admitting to something far worse than she had ever imagined. "What happened to Henry?" she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. Arthur's face twisted, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "Henry became a threat, not just to Eleanor, but to everything we had built. Do you think this family's fortune came from kindness? From love? No. It came from power, manipulation, and control. Eleanor wanted to throw all that away for a man who meant nothing in the grand scheme of things." Emma stepped back, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a suffocating cloud. She had known there were dark corners in the Lancaster family's history, but hearing it from Arthur, hearing the cold justification in his voice, was like a punch to the gut. Arthur continued, his gaze never leaving her. Henry was expendable. He was an idealist, a romantic fool who thought he could save her. But when push came to shove, Eleanor's loyalty was always to me. And I made sure he was out of the picture. Emma's mind reeled. She could barely comprehend what he was saying. She had suspected that the disappearance of Henry had something to do with the family. But this admission of calculated cruelty, was more than she could have ever imagined. "You," she took a shaky breath, forcing herself to look him in the eye. "You had him killed." Arthur's expression didn't change. He didn't need to confirm it with words. The truth was in his eyes. He wasn't worth the risk, not when everything else was at stake. The room seemed to close in on her. She staggered slightly, her legs feeling like they might give way beneath her. This wasn't just a family betrayal. It was murder, manipulation, the complete erasure of someone's life for the sake of power and control. And all along, Emma had been cleaning up the pieces, serving them, trusting them. Arthur took another step closer, his voice low and cold. "You should have stayed out of it, Emma. You should have known better than to go digging where you didn't belong. But now that you've uncovered this, you've made it personal." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, sliding it across the counter toward her. "Consider this a warning. Let it go, and leave this house. For good." Emma stared at the paper, her pulse pounding in her ears. She felt the weight of his words like a noose tightening around her neck. But then something shifted inside her. There was a quiet fire that burned in her chest, a quiet fury that had been building for days. She was scared, terrified, even, but she would not let Arthur Lancaster control her. Not anymore. With a steadying breath, Emma picked up the paper and held it for a moment before folding it back into her hand. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. "I won't," she said quietly but firmly, meeting Arthur's gaze. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." Arthur's expression flickered, something dark and dangerous flickering behind his eyes, but he didn't respond. He turned on his heel and walked out of the room, leaving Emma standing there, shaken but resolute. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had the power to choose her own fate. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now coming back. The aftermath of the confrontation hung heavy in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst at any moment. Emma had returned to her small room in the attic after her exchange with Arthur, but sleep wouldn't come. The events of the evening replayed in her mind over and over, the weight of Arthur's confession sinking deeper into her bones. He had admitted it, everything: the affair, the disappearance of Henry, the lengths the Lancaster family had gone to protect their name. She had known there was something dark hidden beneath their perfect facade, but hearing it confirmed in his cold, indifferent voice made it feel too real. Emma had expected to feel vindicated, like a weight had been lifted, but instead, she felt sick. She had expected Arthur to be an antagonist, a villain in a story she was trying to unravel, but now that the truth was laid bare, it felt like everything had shifted. Arthur wasn't just a powerful man protecting his reputation. He was a man who had betrayed his wife, destroyed lives, and used his power to silence the truth. And yet, he had said it all without a flicker of remorse. He was still the same man who walked through the mansion's halls with a sense of unchallenged authority. The next few days were a blur of tension. Emma kept her head down, going through the motions of her daily tasks as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Arthur no longer looked at her with that cold detachment. Now, his eyes held something else: suspicion. He knew she knew too much, and he wasn't going to let her forget it. The air between them was thick with unspoken threats. Whenever he passed her in the halls, there was a heaviness to his gaze, a quiet promise that no one was untouchable. Emma's days in the mansion felt numbered, but she didn't know how long she could continue to play the part of the obedient maid while carrying the weight of the truth. Margaret, too, seemed different now. The once quiet housekeeper had become more watchful, more withdrawn. Emma caught her watching her at odd moments, her expression unreadable. Margaret's cryptic warnings no longer felt like well-meaning advice. They felt like threats, as though the housekeeper knew exactly how dangerous the situation had become. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret had known more than she had let on, that she had been complicit in hiding the family's secrets for years. The old woman had always seemed loyal to the Lancasters, but Emma wondered now if that loyalty had limits. On the 5th day after the confrontation, Emma found herself standing in front of the mansion's grand front doors, the cool breeze ruffling her hair. She had just finished her work for the day, but something was different about this evening. The air was thick with change. She had been thinking about the choice before her for days. Stay, continue to live in the shadows, or leave the mansion and the tangled web of lies behind. She couldn't pretend anymore that her life would ever return to normal, not after everything she had uncovered. The events surrounding Eleanor, Arthur, and Henry had already altered the course of her life beyond repair. As Emma stood there, the sound of footsteps behind her broke her concentration. She turned to see Margaret walking towards her, her face grim. There was no warmth in her expression now, only the weight of something unspoken. "You should leave," Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not safe for you here anymore. They'll make sure of that." Emma's heart raced. The words hung in the air like a final judgment. She had known this was coming, but hearing it from Margaret, the person who had watched over the house for years, made it feel so much more real. The warning was clear, but Emma didn't know if she was ready to walk away from everything. The mansion, the Lancasters, the secrets, it was all too much. But one thing was certain: staying here would never be the same. The fallout from her discovery would follow her, whether she stayed or left. "I don't know where I would go," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. The thought of leaving, of walking away from everything she had known, was both terrifying and strangely liberating. I don't have a place. No one to turn to. Margaret's eyes softened for the briefest moment, a flicker of something human breaking through the hardness. You have yourself, she said gently. That's all anyone ever really has in the end. The word stung, and for a moment, Emma felt a lump form in her throat. Margaret had always been the quiet observer, the person who knew more than she let on. Now, Emma realized that the housekeeper had seen the truth long before she had. And that truth was that survival was about more than just keeping secrets. It was about having the courage to face them, even if it meant walking away from everything you knew. With a final glance at the mansion's towering facade, Emma made her decision. The fallout had already begun, and there was no turning back. But in that moment, standing with Margaret, Emma understood that the most dangerous thing of all was not the Lancaster family's wrath, but the silence they had tried to impose on her, and on everyone who had ever walked through their doors. Emma wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time, she was ready to face it. The days that followed felt like a slow, suffocating descent. Emma moved through the halls of the Lancaster mansion like a ghost, her movements mechanical, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear, guilt, and unresolved questions. Arthur's words had unsettled her in ways she hadn't anticipated. He had offered her the truth, the cold, raw details of his actions. But what was she supposed to do with that truth now? The power dynamics of the household had shifted, and Emma knew she was no longer just a bystander. She was part of something much larger now, and the weight of it all pressed on her chest like an anchor. She had spent nights lying awake in her small attic room, turning over her options, trying to find a way out of the labyrinth of lies and betrayal she had unknowingly stepped into. Could she leave? Could she walk away from it all? The family, the mansion, and the dangerous pull of Eleanor's unfinished story? The idea of fleeing had crossed her mind more than once, but it felt like a betrayal of its own, like abandoning the very woman who had trusted her with her deepest secrets. The diary had shown Emma the pain, the regret, the passion that had driven Eleanor to make the choices she did. But it also showed her the woman's courage, the quiet strength that had kept her going in the face of insurmountable odds. And now, Emma realized it was her turn to make a choice. She couldn't live in the mansion anymore, pretending that the life around her hadn't crumbled into something ugly. The quiet hum of luxury, the soft rustle of silk dresses, and the clinking of fine china at dinner had once seemed so alluring, so far from the life she had known. But now, those sounds only reminded her of the hollowed-out truth beneath them. The betrayal, the lies, the power that had twisted everything. She couldn't unsee it, unlearn it. The quiet that filled the house was almost oppressive, and Emma found herself avoiding everyone. Margaret no longer met her eyes, and the other staff members, sensing the shift, kept their distance as well. But it was Arthur who haunted her thoughts the most. He had given her the truth, but it had come with a chilling proposition. Stay quiet, and she would be left untouched. Expose it, and everything she knew, her job, her life, her safety, would be on the line. She spent an entire morning cleaning the drawing room, absent-mindedly polishing the silver candlesticks, her hands moving on autopilot. But her mind was elsewhere, running over every possibility. There was only one question left now. What did she want? The decision felt impossible. On one hand, she could turn her back on it all, keep her head down, play her part, and live a quiet life in the shadows of the mansion. Arthur's cold threat loomed large, but the fear of losing everything, of being cast aside without a second thought, was a powerful motivator. She could remain silent, keep the family's secrets buried, and walk away from this life with nothing but the cost of her silence. But then there was Eleanor. Emma couldn't escape the image of the woman who had once walked these halls, her heart torn apart by betrayal and lies. Eleanor had been silenced too. She had fought for her family, for her reputation, and had paid the price with her heart. Emma couldn't just let that history repeat itself. She couldn't be complicit in a family's destruction of the truth. Her heart pounded in her chest as she made her decision. Emma knew it wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, with consequences she wasn't prepared for, but she couldn't go on pretending. She had seen too much, She had lived too long in the silence that surrounded the Lancaster name. If she did nothing now, she would be forever haunted by the weight of what she knew. The time had come to make a choice, one that would define her, one that would set her on a path of uncertainty. She would confront Arthur. She would tell him everything she knew. She would expose the truth, even if it meant losing everything. But what she would never lose, Emma realized, was her integrity. The truth, even if it shattered the world around her, was the only thing she had left. With resolve settling in her chest, Emma stepped away from the polishing cloth and looked around the empty room. She didn't know what the next steps would bring, but for the first time in days, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. It was time to rewrite the ending of this story, her story, and for once, she would be the one in control. Weeks passed, but the weight of the Lancaster family's secrets never quite left Emma. Life at the mansion had returned to its familiar rhythm, but for her, everything had changed. The house was no longer just a place of work. It had become a mausoleum of broken promises, hidden lies, and unfinished stories. She walked the halls with a quiet resignation, aware of the ever-present tension beneath the surface, yet too hesitant to bring it to light. The world she had once viewed through the lens of a maid's simple existence now felt like a carefully constructed facade that she could see through all too clearly. Her decision had been made. She would leave, not immediately but soon. The diary, the confrontations, the dark revelations, everything had led her to this point. She couldn't be a part of this any longer, couldn't continue to live within these walls knowing the cost of the secrets they contained. It wasn't just Arthur or the family's facade that disturbed her. It was the realization that by staying, she would become complicit in keeping those secrets alive. Emma had always prided herself on being invisible, moving through the mansion unnoticed. But in the wake of everything she had uncovered, she realized how much her own silence had allowed the injustices to persist. She had heard Margaret's hushed warnings, seen Arthur's cold eyes, and yet she had allowed herself to be swept along in the currents of the family's power, as if they had no effect on her life. But they did. They always had. It was on her last day in the mansion that Emma found herself in the library once again, standing before the shelves that had once hidden the diary. The book had long since been returned to its secret place, its revelations still fresh in her mind. Eleanor's story was unfinished, but Emma knew that she couldn't carry it with her. The truth had been told, and it was time for her to close the chapter. The final pieces of the puzzle had been put together, and though the scandal and betrayal would live on in whispered conversations among the few who knew, Emma couldn't be a part of it anymore. She couldn't keep hiding behind the shadows of their secrets. Arthur had made it clear in their last conversation that he had no intention of letting her leave quietly. But Emma was resolute. She had made up her mind, and there was no turning back now. The power he held over her was no longer enough to keep her tethered to a life of silence and fear. In the end, it wasn't just about the secret she had uncovered, but about her own sense of dignity and self-respect. She would leave this place and reclaim the life that had always been hers, no matter how uncertain that future might be. As she packed the few belongings she had brought with her years ago, Emma felt a strange sense of liberation. The room was as it had always been, small, sparsely furnished, and tucked away in the attic. But now it felt like her sanctuary, a space she had made her own. She took one last look at the worn walls, the cracked window that allowed the sliver of moonlight to filter through, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a deep breath. When Emma stepped out of the mansion's gates, she knew that she was leaving behind a chapter of her life that could never be fully erased. The story of the Lancasters, of Eleanor's love and betrayal, of Arthur's ruthless ambition, would linger with her forever. But it was no longer her story to carry. She had learned that sometimes the hardest part of finding the truth was knowing when to let go of it. Walking away, Emma found a quiet peace. The world outside the mansion was vast and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of hope. She didn't know exactly where she would go or what she would do, but she knew that her future was hers to create. She was free, not just from the mansion, but from the burden of its secrets. And as she walked away from the place that had once been her prison, she finally let go of the shadows that had followed her for so long. The diary, the family, the scandal, it was all behind her now. She had found closure, not in the answer she had uncovered, but in the decision to move forward. The past would always be part of her, but it would no longer define her. With every step, Emma felt lighter, freer, more herself than she had in years. And though she didn't look back at the mansion, the heavy gates, or the house that held so many secrets, she knew that it was no longer a part of her. She had walked away from it, and in doing so, she had found herself. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.